For those of you with eyes to see and ears to hear, condone the Pov Man on a journey to solve the mysterious case of the Idaho 4.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And I know I've been away for just a little bit. Had one of my crews go down. I had to step in and get out there and get these hands dirty, but that's okay. I've been working on this stuff at night, and now I'm ready to start bringing you some real stuff. In the last video, I put out a hypothesis about certain events after the crime. And with all this new information that's come out, I've been cross-referencing things. And, you know, sometimes when I look at this stuff, it almost scares me because it's so almost easy to see. I mean, once you put everything together. So in this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start reaffirming that hypothesis that I put out the other day. And all the things that I'm looking at around this situation, if you're able to really pull them to the side, separate them from all of the other nonsense, and extrapolate the real information, then a picture becomes very, very clear. And at some point, I think we need to get this group of individuals that I'm going to suggest in this video in a room, and somebody needs to hammer them for the truth, because the truth has certainly not been told in this case. Are you ready? Hold on to your hats, folks. Let's show you how you take a hypothesis and turn it into a theory. First of all, when I take these footprints that I found in the snow that really gives me a clear image of these diamond treads, and then I overlay right on top of them the diamond treads found in a Meadow Black outside Dylan's door, I become about 99.9% sure whoever left these footprints in the snow also left a footprint by Dylan's door, because they match exactly. I can make it a little bit bigger here, and you can see how they overlay exactly. So I'm no longer doubting this hypothesis that whoever made the footprints in the snow is the one that made the bloody footprints in the house. Now, was that the perpetrator, or was that somebody that came after the fact? I think it was somebody that came after the fact. Now, we know based on how they tried to measure these boot prints is the first time they put a regular boot print measurement tape in here, and look, it was nowhere near long enough to measure the actual size of this boot. So they had to come back and take a second photo with a much longer measurement device to try to get the accurate determination of how big this shoe size was, and it appears to be very large. Somebody has a big foot.
Turns now, it's maybe a surprising message from the guy who essentially invented the Labradoodle, if you will. This is the breeder. He's calling the Labrador Poodle mix his worst regret, saying this opened up a Pandora's box, which essentially makes breeding dogs big business.
And what I find odd is when we look at these footprints in the snow, they all seem to be going in the same direction as this dog print in the snow, which I would assume would be Murphy's. I mean, each one is very unique, and they're heading in the same direction as the dog, almost exactly. So it tells me that at some point, somebody was following Murphy in the backyard and was attempting to get Murphy, which, since we see Murphy about an hour later using the bathroom over at Jack D's house, I would have to assume that that person that got Murphy just took him over to Jack D's, which creates a whole nother issue in this. Because when I start putting these pieces together and I start really thinking about it, we got Murphy who starts barking about 4:17 as we believe the atrocity has taken place, and then he continues to bark even after that Ford Explorer pulls in at 4:29. I mean, he continues to bark till about 5 a.m. and then all of a sudden stops barking, which tells me that he stopped barking because somebody must have picked him up, took him to somebody's place to, for them to hold them until later on that morning, where obviously somebody brought them back over and put them in the house. So when I think of, who really cares about these Labradoodles as much as they must have to do all this, I mean, only a couple thoughts come to mind. Then I go to some of the information that's released in this new book, and I cross-reference it with things that I already know, and I see what the picture that it paints starts to look like. Now, what I've done is I've taken out of the book all of the entries that are logged for the Ford Explorer. And it says that at 1919 hours, the Explorer leaves the King Road house. And this is basically how they describe it or how Whitcomb describes it in all of the boxes. It says the Explorer leaves the King Road house. And then at 1926, the Explorer arrives at Kappa Alpha Theta. Then about 30 minutes later, the Explorer leaves Kappa Alpha Theta. And then about 7 minutes later, it arrives at Hungadunga. And then about a little over an hour later, it leaves Hungadunga. And then it says the Explorer arrives back at Kappa Alpha Theta at 2106. But then at 2121, the Explorer leaves Kappa Alpha Theta. And then for the first time in all of this, it never says this before, but now for some reason they add in a little parentheses, believed to be driven by Ethan. Not driven by Ethan. None of these said it was driven by Ethan, but this time it says believed to be driven by Ethan, which I find to be interesting that even ends up in there. Because then at 2124, the Explorer stops at Sigma Chi. And again, it says believed to be driven by Ethan. And then 1 minute later, the Explorer leaves Sigma Chi at 2125. Believed to be driven by Ethan. But then at 2126, it says Ethan, this is another spot that I had to pull out and insert in here because it was all out of order, but it says Ethan sends Hunter Johnson a snap message. Says he's drinking with Xana and Bethany. Come hang out. We already know that Bethany was at Sigma Chi. So if the Explorer arrives at Sigma Chi at 2124 and Ethan sends a Snapchat to Hunter saying he's with Xana at Sigma Chi, come on and hang with us and we're drinking here, then that tells me that whoever was driving the Explorer when it left Sigma Chi that was believed to be Ethan wasn't Ethan, because Ethan a minute later is at Sigma Chi drinking. So who was driving this Explorer that left at 2125 that was believed to be Ethan? Because next they want us to believe that the Explorer arrives back at 1122 King Road, believed to be driven by Ethan, where it stays the rest of the night, which we know isn't true. So when I put all of this together and I look at the time frame and I think of whose phone that nobody can ever find because it was broken or stolen or lost or whatever, and they supposedly went to bed at 10 p.m. that night and slept all night. Well, it tells me that according to Pob, the Explorer arrives back at Kappa Alpha Theta, driven by Hunter, because I don't believe that Ethan could leave at 2125, go to the King Road residence, and then still be texting Hunter Johnson to come to Sigma Chi and have a drink with him and Xana and Bethany. So it tells me that part didn't happen, and somebody else left that house driving the Explorer, left Sigma Chi. And I believe it makes sense that they went back to Kappa Alpha Theta. And I think it makes sense that it's possibly Mr. Hunter that was driving that thing. And the reason I say that is because I've always questioned who was driving the Ford Explorer and where they were coming from that night. Because I knew that at 428, that thing did not come from Sigma Chi. It came from another direction. And I've always wondered where this thing was coming from, because as you can see up here, watch as its headlights appear. It always appears, and when I slow it down, there's no way to tell if it was coming to the right there or if it was coming straight. I believe it was coming straight. But it certainly wasn't coming from Sigma Chi, because it would have shown up that it was coming from Sigma Chi's direction. So it was coming up actually from over that hill. And I always thought, where the heck is this thing actually coming from? And as it comes down and it goes around, we know that is the Ford Explorer. But the place that it was coming from was not Sigma Chi. So it always made me go, where the heck could this have been coming from? Now I think I know. And just to prove that further, you can see this vehicle at a different time coming over the hill, and it's actually going to turn. You'll see it turn right here. And if it was coming from Sigma Chi, you would be able to see it much like you'll see this vehicle. Watch as it goes towards Sigma Chi. See it? You can clearly see when vehicles come and go from the area of Sigma Chi. The 428 vehicle didn't. And just to verify that, this is just a few minutes or a few seconds before the 428 vehicle shows up, and you'll see there's nothing coming from the direction of Sigma Chi at all. You just all of a sudden see the headlights right there of it coming over the hill. It's coming from north of that area. Now, if you want to see some crazy stuff, let's start testing this hypothesis to see if it holds water. Remember, we go back to this list in Whitcomb's book that logs the movements of the Explorer, and it says at 21:25, the Explorer leaves Sigma Chi, and it says believed to be driven by Ethan. But we know that can't be true if Ethan is still at Sigma Chi a minute later, texting Hunter to come have drinks with him and Xana and Bethany at Sigma Chi. Tells us somebody else drove off in that Ford Explorer. Then it says the Ford Explorer arrived at 1122 King Road, believed to be driven by Ethan. I don't think it arrived there at all. I believe that Explorer left and went back to Kappa Alpha Theta, and it was driven by Hunter. It just happens to be the exact time that Hunter's phone, according to him, would, he was asleep, and then his phone somehow, gets lost or whatever. That kind of opens the door. If Hunter left in the Ford Explorer and went to Kappa Alpha Theta to see, I don't know, does he have a girlfriend there? I don't know. But let's follow this progression. See, Kappa Alpha Theta is up here. And that was a big red flag when I looked at where Kappa Alpha Theta was in comparison to the King Road residence, because we know that the Ford Explorer was coming from that direction heading south on Blake when we first see it. So let's see if these times add up, because we can go back to Dylan's exhaustive phone records, and in the book, Whitcomb mentions at 4:27 a call to Kaylee, but he never puts in his boxes the Snapchats to Ethan before that, and certainly doesn't put in here this 4:27:11 FaceTime, Apple FaceTime call. That was an outgoing call to an unknown person, which I would think that would be somebody they could identify since it was a FaceTime call from Apple, but yet they don't want to identify them. 4:27:11. Let's plug this on our map. So Dylan places a FaceTime call to an unknown individual at 4:27:11. Then we see that black Ford Explorer top the hill heading towards the King Road residence at 4:27:51, about 40 seconds later. So as we start to plug this on the map, if Dylan called, say, Hunter at Kappa Alpha Theta, and he jumped right in that Ford Explorer and started heading that way at 4:27:11, and then we see it topple the hill at 4:27:51 coming from that direction heading to the King Road residence. Well, dang, things start to actually line up perfectly. And then I go to this, right? Because it's my interpretation of events looking at the call records from Dylan that she makes a call to Xana at 4:28:44 after making a bunch of other calls before that. But then right as the black Ford Explorer pulls into the King Road house at 4:29, Dylan magically doesn't make any calls for 4 minutes until finally she placed a text to Kaylee saying, please answer. And I think that time frame right there of 4 minutes of silence right as that black Ford Explorer pulls into the house is telling. Because then, according to the records, From 4:32:58 until 5 o'clock, 27 minutes and 2 seconds, there is no activity on Dylan's phone. Now we find out in the records for the first entry that they had of Dylan's phone steps, says she recorded 30 steps exactly at this time, at 5 a.m. And what I believe this is showing is the last 30 steps of Dylan's steps. And it records it at 5 a.m. because it happened prior to 5 a.m. As much research as I can do on these steps are not meant to be an exact science, but it does give you indications of when things did happen. So for instance, there weren't any steps or level changes noted before 5 a.m. We know Dylan went from upstairs to the downstairs room from 4:26 to 4:27. So it didn't record anything about any of that, but it just finally starts recording 30 steps at 5 a.m. I believe it's the last 30 steps Dylan and Bethany took as they went over to the Whites with their friends. And that is just more verification of that to me, because as soon as she gets over there and records those 30 steps, then she's on the phone for another hour and a half engaged in activity. So Pob's theory is at 4:32, when she places this last text to Kaylee, then they head over to their friend's place at the Whites. Now, when we look further into everything involved in this, and we go down to 10:56 a.m. of Dylan's phone usage, where she's logged into Instagram, there is another period of silence from 10:56:49 until 11:02:02, where she starts receiving and sending Snapchat messages. So this period of silence right here, I find very interesting, because according to Whitcomb, at 11 o'clock exactly in between these two periods of silence, Dylan's activity sensor, it says 3.0, distance traveled 120 feet, flights climbed 2. I believe this is the time that Dylan and Bethany had to come back to the King Road residence, and they got back there a little after 11 o'clock. And so that's a good indication that's when they returned to the house. And then I put in some of the other information that he logged in here from police reports that really kind of knocked this thing out of the park, and that is neighbor Nadeau walking his dog. He notes that at 10:08, the neighbor Nadeau walks his dog and says he passed the King Road residence and notes that the front door is wide open. But then on his way back from walking the dog, he notes at 10:59, he comes back past the King Road residence and says that front door is still open. So at 10:08, it's open, 10:59, it's open. But according to this activity of the steps and Dylan's sensor activity, between that time is when Dylan and Bethany would have likely come back to the house just a little after neighbor Nadeau walked past for the second time. And that's when they would have entered the house and closed the door. So the timelines of Nadeau's walk and noting the door being open right before they would have come back to the house, I think, is a slam dunk. But for everything to work out exactly like I just said, then we would have to assume that all the people involved in the 911 call would have known about this long before they ever made the 911 call. And we see all the people that were there present for the 911 call, but that wouldn't be it. We would expect to see at least 2 more people show up after the 911 call, just suspiciously soon after the 911 call, and they should be acting just a little bit strange, like they already knew what was happening. Did we see 2 other people that would have been involved in this scenario show up right after the 911 call acting strange? And yeah, I think we did. I think we seen 2 other individuals show up independently of each other, but both acting really strange right at the time that they showed up, which you have to know was very, very suspicious. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.